All right, welcome everybody. Happy May 22nd, 2024. Welcome to the April 2024 Jobs Report and Inflation Update, where we come here to answer one or two questions. And the main question really is just where the heck is the job market headed? And is inflation coming down so that interest rates can come down so that I can be employed again? With us, as always, is Dr. Riley White of the University of New Mexico. He's the Associate Professor of Finance as well as the Assistant Dean. And he's here to talk with
I get to
Associate.
associate with deans. Yeah. I get to
Okay, Associate Dean. I always
yeah,
get that confused for some reason, and I
yeah,
don't
like
really
I
like it.
associate. I used to be an assistant dean a couple of years ago, and then they upgraded me, gave me more responsibilities and no additional pay, and that was great. So
Okay. So he's and Albert's List resident economist, who
that's
we
right.
ask all the
That's the
tough
real
questions to.
job.
Yeah.
Yes. I live in a basement. I live in a basement in
You could be
Oakland.
the
Yes.
you could be the assistant to the regional manager too, if you'd like. Um,
Hey, that's a prestigious title.
it is. He's here with trends, news, and views that you should know as you go through your job search. And so, for those of you who are in the crowd, feel free to ask your questions as we go through this presentation. Pull up a chair or a drink because you probably will need it, and enjoy. Without further ado, Dr. White.
All right. Thank you, Albert, for the introduction. Thank you, Colin, for rocking and rolling as always. And as always, when you have a question, answer it. You've seen our very lively webinar chat. Make sure that happens. Aaron's absolutely right. Senior, just make up a title. I'll take it. So on this one today, we've got some excitement today on our April 2024 jobs report recollection here. We've got some good data. Aaron sent me some good articles I pulled from. I got some other questions that the audience answered, which were excellent, and I'm so excited to cover some of them. And we've got sort of a sense of where things are going. So I handled a few topics. Please, again, if there's any things you want to add to the chat window, any things you want to include, we usually have Aaron is like the economics guru wingman. He drops in links, faster than like a hurricane in there. So if anything is said or if anything is incorrect or anything I say that is or is not backed up, you'll see the academic article pop up in the chat window. Likewise, feel free to ask anything for clarification. All right, so you know me, I'm Riley White. It is May. We are talking about April. And, I'm doing my best with AI imagery to keep things sunny and shiny and hopeful involving the Albert's List jobs report. There is no part of this bridge that makes sense, Albert. Exactly right. And one of the things when people say, one of my questions that was fielding was the application of AI and making perfect graphics in a very short amount of time for the purpose of webinar chats are not part of the current forte. Econ data, the Neil Young of econ data. That's great. That's great. That's really oh man, that's fascinating, Like, are you like Harvest Moon Neil Young? Or are you like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young? Yeah, that's interesting. We'll see what Aaron comes up with. That's his goal. So things to go over today. So you've heard about this Crosby, Stills, Nash Young. I saw Graham Nash live many years ago when I was at Boston University, and he was playing at the Paradise Rock Club for like $11. So it was exciting. So the Scorpions, Andrew Baum stepping in. So here's the deal with the job market right now. This was not an exciting jobs report, and there's some debate as to how good or bad it was. So there were 175,000 new jobs added. Yay, congratulations. Now, the Economic Policy Institute argues that maybe the equilibrium job market should be about 125,000 jobs every month. If you are looking at some of the other data, population data, immigration data in particular, actually our job creation should probably be a bit higher than that to reach equilibrium. I would argue probably more in the 2 to 250 range where we are right now. But it depends, and it depends on the data that you have available too. Unemployment rose slightly to 3.9%. Now this is still pretty good, but overall it does mean we have seen this indicated increase in unemployment over the last few months that has been steady. And I'll get into some of those numbers shortly. Now, where were these jobs added in the last month? About 87,000 was in healthcare and social assistance. That is a huge amount in healthcare that we've seen over the last few months in particular. 22,000 in transportation. That's been variable. Transportation and warehousing was hit heavily by the supply chain issues. They hired a ton of new workers to accommodate them, and now then they laid off some of those workers, and now they're still reaching some type of transportation equilibrium. And we've got 20,000 in retail. Again, a positive sign when we look at signs that look at the economic growth and consumer spending and all that. But we've lost, and this is the key, we've lost across the country 8,000 jobs in information and 4,000 in professional and business services. And if you're sitting on this webinar, logically speaking, if I draw you randomly from the San Francisco Bay Area population and then add in an occasional Aaron or, the occasional guy from, Florida or somebody from Minnesota or somebody from, Yemen, we're going to end up with a ratio that skews heavily towards information and professional and business services. There are reasons for this, and it's very challenging to put, because it's what we've seen over and over again, that these particular jobs, while they all require college degrees and while they all have extensive educational requirements to get you there, often are still struggling in very profound ways. And this is an interesting thing, and it's not a sign of, you look at the economy right now skewing heavily towards a lot of jobs that don't pay a great deal of money, with the exception of healthcare, but healthcare is also so broad. I'm not talking merely doctors. I'm talking about the entire healthcare apparatus, including people who might say, work for insurance companies or work in other office or other tasks or other tasks. We don't see significant growth in a large amount of the sector of the population. 8,000 in government is nice, but not stellar. Manufacturing growth of 8,000 is also pleasant, but not enough to write home about. And that's the interesting part about this. So Antonio says, hey, do these figures take into account full versus part-time jobs? Interestingly, they do not. And one of the things that's actually very interesting to note is that difference between full and part-time. We had a little bit of a discussion last time on this last month, Antonio, but if your instinct is, are more people employed in part-time work than before, and are fewer people, relatively speaking, employed in full-time as a ratio of the population, you would be correct. We've actually seen a shift towards more part-time work, and that's interesting, and that's an argument that we can see from both sides. It is not yet fully clear if a lot of these jobs that are looking in the part-time sector, exactly, it feels correct, but why? And so one thing could be is that, hey, are people not getting the hours, not getting what they need? And then the other part of this is, well, there's the question of U6, which is our underemployed unemployment measure. The unemployment measures issued by the government have about 6 different levels: U1, U2, U3, U4, U5, and U6. And you are probably going crazy trying to determine what these numbers mean. But U3 is what we typically offer as our unemployment rate. That takes our labor force, looks at the amount of people who are either have a job or are looking for work, and divides that by that total denominator. And we end up with about 3.9%, which is pretty good. You drop out of that labor force, you're no longer counted as part of those numbers. But then we have discouraged workers and workers who might be underemployed. That features heavily into U6. And while we haven't seen in U6, and I'll grab this data for you right now, because Fred has a nice little link about this here. That data is coming up as well. And it's gone up from about, if we look at just the last year, this is an incredibly deceptive chart. I'm going to just drop in here. So I'm going to put this in here for those people in the cheap seats looking at the St. Louis Fed data. I'm going to print screen this mofo and I'll send it your way. And I got this 1, 2, 3, 4. So to kind of go with Antonio's question about this, these are people who are unemployed plus persons marginally attached to the labor force plus total employed part-time for economic reasons, yada, yada, are people not getting the jobs that they want. And it's gone up pretty steadily in the last year from about 6.6% to 7.4%. Now, still historically, if we go over a long time, these are low numbers, but they're not the lowest that we've seen. And now we're climbing back into a place that we saw in 2018. This isn't the best numbers we've seen, and we've certainly seen these values lower than this in the 2000s and before. And so it is happening. Antonio, thank you for sharing as well. Antonio says, that's me. I lost my job 2 years ago and I've had exactly 3 interviews since. That is tragic. I'm not counted anywhere in the stats, which again feel like we aren't getting a complete picture. And that's true. And so if you feel left out, it's okay. And that's a valid feeling because you might actually be left out of these numbers. That's the weird part about looking at aggregates, right? I say all of these things, in economics in general, we have a lot of models. I can point to dozens of articles that say, hey, things like economic concepts we all agree on, like, oh, free trade, lower restrictions, those are all good things, but they affect people differently. In aggregate, they're good, but what they do is they can often lead to unequal outcomes, and they can also create unemployment in certain sectors while boosting employment in other sectors. And so there's a lot of unevenness even when we look at this data, and that's important to view all this. And your experience in this market is completely valid for that reason. Oh, that's great. So Melanie says, is any of this related to the aging of the workforce? Great question. With a greater number of job seekers greater than 40, there will be more barriers to getting hired full time. Absolutely true. And so that's interesting. So implied in that, the question is there ageism concerns, but also are we looking at, say, secondary career options? Are we looking at new career options? And we've certainly seen that. And so a long story short in that question, one way you can look at this is if you think about something as simple as a 401k, chances are if you had a full-time job in the last 20 years, you have a 401k, you know somebody who has a 401k, you've thought about putting money in a 401k. So the story of the 401k was only goes back to the late 70s with the creation of IRAs as permitted by Congress for the first time. And then it was 1980 before it was you could legally set up an IRA account, which of course led to corporations creating all these 401ks and all that stuff. And so you're looking at a period of time that basically just is 45 years long or less, where people have even had these investment vehicles as an option to put money in. Before that time, about a third of Americans were on pensions or other types of financial benefits for their retirement. And the issue was, of course, when you have something like a pension, somebody else manages your money for you. You get a fixed sum after you retire. 401k kind of places that on you. They say, hey, you got to put your money aside right now, 2%, 3%, 5%, whatever it is that you can afford. And you have to build that up yourself and kind of know what that value is. And we did this without really teaching people anything about financial literacy. And so as a consequence, we see a lot of people reaching retirement age now for the first time that have insufficient amounts of retirement money. You always need much more money than you ever think you might need. And so a lot of people are sensibly looking to the job market and saying, hey, I'm retired now, but not really. Maybe I can get a job. And so what's interesting about the U6 data is we're looking towards these people who are particularly discouraged. And so a retiree who would be looking for a full-time job, but not necessarily, and it depends on the age of the retiree, looking at how that data would pan out might be counted in that characteristic. But we're really focused in U6 on discouraged workers. But you're going to see this throughout. And, one thing as well, especially as you look towards your own retirements, always put more money in than you think you need. Just think the proportion of Americans who need long-term care is much higher than you think it is. And even if you feel, I feel good, and you're running marathons and you're 80 years old, if you reach 90, you reach 85, some other level, you might have medical needs, you might have other issues that are just absolutely taxing and potentially creates a situation where you might not be able to live successfully on your own. And if you've ever dealt with an elderly relative in the recent times and had to try to figure out how much you'd have to spend or budget for to maintain long-term care, it is astoundingly expensive. It's breathtakingly expensive to do. So things to think about too. This is really exciting. Oh, look at this. So Albert's got some things. There we go. We got some marginal rates. Good. Thank you, Albert. Andrew's got a link to, was the 401k a mistake? Look at this. They're just dropping things without me saying the words. This is why I love this audience so much. I just infer things. you just drop them in the links. I love it. A+ for you guys. I'm going to print you all out degrees and you'll have, it'll be great. We'll do it. So, that's a good question. So Melanie's absolutely right. I'm certain that's part of it, though. And we can do actually a breakdown on age at some future level, too. I love that question. I love that observation. Thanks, Melanie. So other things to think about here as well. Hourly earnings increased just 7 cents. And that's a 2.5% annual rate. That is a slow level of growth. The combination of low job increases plus, hey, we're not going to pay you a lot more money. That's a tightening job market if ever I've seen one. So let's move on down. So let's blow off the dust a bit and look under the hood and see what's actually happening in the jobs market. So one of the things that popped up in the last month has been initial jobless claims. And we've seen there's a whole bunch of data here, and I'll kind of focus on each one. The chart at the upper left looks at the initial claims versus recent non-COVID averages. And we had this surprising, not surprising, but substantial jump in initial claims that happened. And we've seen kind of since the beginning of the year, basically, a trend upward in initial jobless claims. These are people who are looking at unemployment, claiming unemployment for the first time. And then you have continuing claims also on the rise on the chart in the upper right. And then if you look at initial claims by year, across the board from 2018, 2019, 2020 to 2021. 2024 and the 4-week averages we're still tracking as we were in previous years, but our continuing claims are starting to edge a little bit higher than what we've seen in previous periods. And that's a really interesting question. Aaron says 401k should be reformed. It's not a mistake. We should change the law so that everyone over 18 is eligible for simple 401ks, mandated 3% deductions for all employees, and employer 5% of wages, almost 80 or 90% of population full retirement security. So that's a good thing, because what you're saying now doesn't really resemble the type of 401k that people signed up for. But the idea that you have this mandatory spending is actually a way you could reform it in a meaningful way to keep people from underinvesting in retirement. It is going to be a particular challenge in financing this as we go through the next few decades. And so our ability to privatize and maintain a decent amount of retirement savings is critically important to deal with this. So that's a well taken point, Aaron. Albert says we've also been threatened with a good time again, with the government saying that Social Security will run out by 2035. Didn't we hear that 20 years ago? Indeed. This is really tricky because it depends. So right now, one of the challenges when you look at these things is do we have, and this is sort of the question that underlies this, is do we have too much debt in the economy? So our total US debt. So let's say, so if the federal government spends more money than in a given year than it actually takes in as tax revenue, that is a deficit. So we have run deficits every year since the 90s. Now, deficits, when you add up those deficits this year plus last year plus the year before, you get to something called the total national debt. Now, the national debt is about $34.5 trillion. That's a significant amount of money. But should we worry about it now? Yes and no. And here's in the case for no, when you look at the size of the debt, you say, wow, 35 trillion. That's greater than the size of the total US economy. That's, the debt's increasing by $1 trillion every 100 days. How can we just maintain this? What happens if we did other things to this? And can we just pay it off ourselves? We hear all of this stuff. So first of all, it is debt. It's debt we owe ourselves. It's we owe other countries, anybody that buys US bonds and government debt. But although it's sizable relative to the annual size of our GDP, there's about $140 trillion of assets and wealth in the United States. So compared to our total asset size, it's still relatively small. I know that doesn't provide a great deal of comfort. Because of our position as a reserve currency, the United States has a lot of advantages. That means that it's unlikely that we'll enter a debt crisis situation like Greece did in any time soon. I think, and we have a couple of decades before somebody got around to that. But it will be because in just an effort of we continually spend more money than we have to service that debt. And our debt service has gone up from about 6% of our budget to around 10% of our budget. And what that does is that cuts into some of our services. It cuts into some of the things the government can provide. And as a consequence, that does have a real cost for Americans. And so, we look at this, especially if debt remains higher for longer, we end up in a situation where we have to grapple with this somehow. Good example, go back a decade ago, Jamaica had a 60% debt service ratio, meaning that 60% of the amount of money that the government was taking in each year had to go to pay down its exorbitantly high debt, which basically renders the government incapable of fixing this. And so it is an interesting question. And Aaron has some good ideas here. He's modernizing Social Security. He suggests capturing wage income for Social Security, not just to 160K, but all the way up the income curve. So basically, the idea being that's a really interesting idea too. It's worth talking about. Maybe we can do a deep dive at some point in the future. But we are seeing claims right now going up, and that's an interesting aspect to this. We're seeing claims go up a little bit. We're seeing more unemployment rate, not too crazy levels, but in a way that's observable in a steady way. This chart, of course, if you go to the next chart here by Arch Global, Parker Ross, a good person to follow on Twitter, gets an interesting perspective on some of this stuff. So looking at this is the year-to-year change in unemployment rate. And anything above the line means that the unemployment rate is going up. Anything below the line means it's going down. And so we've transitioned. We've gone from this cycle where in April 2020, we had all of this, we had this massive COVID shock to the economy, millions of people laid off, the unemployment rate shot up. Then we enter $5 trillion of stimulus spending. All these people were hired back. And then now we're in a situation where unemployment's rising again. And it's rising in a way, and it looks kind of like, to Albert's point, the beginning of the rise we saw in 2007, the beginning of the rise that we saw in 2001. It is notable, though, that it's much less steep than both of those. And it's coming from a position of almost a very high level of employment. And so it's interesting to see. And if anything, if nothing changes, that trajectory may continue for a little while. Claudia Sahm, an economist, a famous economist, came up with the Sahm rule, says that you might consider it a recession if unemployment nationally rises more than 0.5% among other factors above where it was before. We've reached it, but not in the same sense. And Claudia Sahm herself is quick to point out and says, hey, a lot of indicators in the economy are still doing really well. And so we haven't really reached that recessionary moment yet. But depends on where you are. So let's talk a little bit about the California tech sector job growth. So again, my favorite one, I love Joe Politano charts. Not only are they this nice Gothic black background and just a fantastically bright, vivid imagery, but they have a lot of good California-focused data items. Looking at the change in employment since 2020, across in California tech jobs, there are still more people now employed in software publishing, in computing infrastructure, data processing, et cetera, than there was in 2020. But you'll notice job losses, there are net fewer people employed in systems design, custom programming, things like web search portals, libraries, and streaming services. All of that stuff being driven downward. And that's interesting because this is really what you're seeing and really what you're feeling here on Albert's list too. Oh, Aaron says, we could say that our stimulus was 5 trillion on the fiscal supply side and 5 trillion on the credit supply side. Together, it's 10 trillion, which is more than anywhere on earth combined. Bam, Aaron. But that's why the US has been lapping the G7 in terms of its economic performance. Is it sustainable? No. But is it fun? Yes. Albert says this chart got a lot of attention last month on Albert's list. Absolutely true. I had to bring it up again just because I know it's something everybody's feeling right now, and it's a very interesting thing. So it depends on where you are. Now, where are jobs being created? Arbor and data science had this handy job. As of March, these were the new AI job postings across the country. Back to the existential question. Are tech jobs leaving California for Texas? Are they leaving it for various other places? They are not leaving them in mass to go to Wyoming, as we found out by this map, but they are very unevenly distributed across the country in a few main areas. So while the biggest numbers are still in California, about 2,800 new AI job postings in 2024, there's 1,200 in Washington, about 1,200 in Texas, about 1,000 in Virginia and New York, and then a motley of other states kind of fill in between. There is a sense that things are going elsewhere, but this is the interesting part about how things develop. When something goes elsewhere, will it stay there, or will one of the tech giants in California merely acquire them at some point in the future and bring some of that information back? Or is this a permanent move? And it is difficult. And a lot of companies look at this and say there's so much to love about California, but the real estate prices, the asset prices, the lack of building the lack of building new things for relatively, that in the ways that prices have been kept high over the last couple decades are barriers to growth. And there's barriers to growth that you will feel more of in the coming years. AI jobs not also coming to New Mexico, so not sitting on a high horse here. Most days I'm on a Shetland pony at best. Like to keep it low to the ground. Aaron says, what's funny is that econ nerds were spending the 2009 to 2020 focused on studying 2008 financial cracks to the mash. I'm the same, Aaron. I wrote a couple papers on the crash. That was great. Now, a new generation will spend the next 10 years studying the 2020 to 2023 intervention the same way. Aaron sees it. That's why Aaron should have, that's why Aaron's an economist in his own right. He sees it too. That is true. We're going to spend years looking at the intervention and what it means for the economy. 100%. God, we came out with that too. I did a paper on the Icelandic banking crisis. I did a paper on the regular old banking crisis. I did all kinds of things. Not worth reading though. But now this is interesting too. So stories of hope. This chart's a couple years old. Research and development value added, and this is as a UNM professor in New Mexico, I like to show this one. This is the share of the state's GDP that was research and development. By far, about 30% of all R&D conducted across the country does happen in California. So even though it represents only 4.8% of the GDP, it is still a sizable. It is the single biggest figure of investment that we have in any state. By percentage, New Mexico highest because we've got 2 national labs here, Sandia National Labs and Los Alamos National Labs, among other things, that keep our research and development value added. We just can't convert that into commercial enterprises, and we have one of the fewest numbers of publicly traded companies in the country. So it's one of those shenanigans. So Aaron says, if you don't do a paper, you'd be chief senior assistant professor. Yeah, just kidding. Add an adjective. That's what academia is all about. Create bureaucracy, add adjectives, bam. That's what we do. That's good. So other positive notes, so positive spin on this. So even though you've seen this chart and you see this chart and you go, well, AI is spread out a bit. California still has the biggest number. You see this one and say, well, GDP or R&D is still happening. See this chart and say, well, where's power infrastructure being developed? So in California in 2021 versus 2024, look at where power happens. These are the megawatts throughout the day. You have imports, gas, wind, hydro, and nuclear. And so while you see some of these figures go up, particularly for wind and hydro, seeing higher numbers there in particular, solar power, a dominant position in the middle of the day. And then you've seen battery installation that enables solar power to be used throughout the day in various parts. And California has led the country in the amount of batteries that have been installed to help maintain this. So that's a very interesting and potentially beneficial thing to note as it pertains to the technological progress in California, even though I was reading The Economist and yet again featuring the new high-speed rail system and how expensive it is and how slow it is relative to other global high-speed rail. Infrastructure, the boon of the American existence. And I had a question today, and this is an interesting one that came not today, but this week that came through the Albert's List shakedown. They said, hey, graduates this year have a rough time. Do you feel that? Do you see that in the data? Is that what we're noting from the numbers that you've seen so far? And it is true. So first of all, there's good news and bad news about right now. And it depends on how deep you dig this particular poll. Albert says it's a bad time to be a college senior. It's not wrong. It's always a bad time to be a college senior. And there probably is, as much as people glamorize being a college student, I would never go back to those days if I could, even though I've made it my entire career. Effectively. Aaron says, what's interesting is how much R&D is accounting reclassed as spending because of the change in R&D depreciation versus actual real R&D old school. That is true. And that's a fascinating point to bring up too. But young workers have experienced the strongest wage growth in the pandemic business cycle. Yay! Pat yourselves on the back, but does that mean anything? And I'll give you a reason why it's much more nuanced than this. So a lot of people point to charts like this one and they say, oh, young people have it great. 2.2% real growth rate in wages between 2020 and 2024. Just look at how terrible it was in every other year. 2001 to 2005, decreased 4.3%. 1990 to 1994, decreased 7.5%. But hey, it's up a couple percent. Yay. But as data has pointed out here, there has been trouble for a lot of new graduates. Looking at this, healthcare and sales have hired well. A lot of other sectors have not, and that has fallen disproportionately along a lot of college lines. Here's an example. Data from Handshake. Handshake came up with this nice little report. I'll see if I can dig it up here somewhere in the midst of this. Labor market report for graduates. So Handshake does this class of 2024 report. And they pointed out that the class of 2024 applied to 21 jobs on average. And that was up from just 14 that they had in the 2023 season. And so that's a really, really interesting thing. And so I'll link you to this report. It's good to read, good to see. I'll link it to everyone. Join Handshake. Thank you so much for correcting that. Network trends, career goals, and the economy. A lot of good data there about graduates right now. Where we see graduates going and where we see these issues. When you have a bachelor's degree and you're out of the market for the first time, young workers have higher unemployment rates than other sectors of workers, period. Recent graduates, all workers, young workers in general, if you've just passed the graduation and you just happen to be a young person, you're dealing with an unemployment rate of around 6% and higher. You're not seeing those 3%, 4% numbers the rest of the economy is. And the year-on-year change in the application share, where are people hiring? A lot of red. People are hiring, people are applying less in California, much more in some other areas of the country. A lot of interesting areas too, more affordable living conditions across much of the Midwest, some areas of the South. Interesting surprises though, especially in the highly expensive but highly massive areas in New York and DC are attracting more applicants, while Boston is attracting fewer. And it's interesting to see how this is happening. Aaron says absolutely right. Grads by major is a key for job matching, and that's absolutely true. Another great report too. Take a look at this historical graduation statistics. Very nice data. So if you're feeling this as a new graduate, you're saying to yourself, it is a hard situation right now. This is one of the reasons why. And look at this data. It shows consistently that you are seeing it. You're seeing a much more nervous class, a much more uncertain class than last year, and one that feels less confident about the type of job they're going for. What's interesting in particular about this sort of handshake report, there's a couple of things that I found very interesting. Financial security was the most important thing. And then they looked at the reasons. Work-life balance is a priority. You know, what kind of companies are they looking for? It was less important that people had a brand that they believed in, and much more important that they had things like stability coming out of the 4 years that you've seen. You can totally guess why. Albert says this class didn't get a high school graduation. Now it gets a bad economy to graduate into. What luck. Bummer. Colin, what do you think? Colin has arrived on scene.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything. I just think it would be helpful for, any graduate students or college students to also maybe get some advice, like what's different this time around, and what advice would you give them to help them job seek and help them differentiate themselves from, the thousands of other applicants, I imagine, to all these jobs? What should they keep in mind as they apply? What should they not neglect to do or look into? And how would they, give themselves an edge? Because when I remember when I graduated and I got some advice from people and peers and friends and seniors and mentors, and some of that advice was good, but most of that advice was more oriented towards what they personally thought would work because of a different time. And as we can tell, times have changed. So any expert advice you would give them, or
Oh,
macro or micro?
Colin, that's a great point. And I will say, and this is where it gets really hard though, because of the heterogeneous nature of job seekers. And I know when we go on the market and we hire people, I have a whole bunch of things that are relatively nuanced, and as you point out, very focused on what I value individually rather than in aggregate the things that differentiate. So, Colin, I appreciate you asking, and I know that everybody here, my guess is all the people, the couple of dozen people we've got floating around here, thank you all for attending, would have very interesting and insightful points to make. A couple of things point out, though, that I feel very strongly about. I feel strongly about upskilling, looking at multiple skills, being able to talk about the skills that you have is important. I'm a big fan of short resumes when you can, which is entirely hypocritical of me because I have like a 45-page academic CV I pass around like somebody's going to read it. And then it comes down to this real thing, like it depends. Like a lot of people don't care about cover letters. I think it shows me who you are as a person. So anecdotally, although maybe, half of people give any care at all about cover letters, it's gotten me my jobs. And so anecdotally, I think that from that perspective, your ability to put in a story about why you're applying and why you feel that that's important distinguishes you from a bunch of resumes in this pile. And here's the thing, and here's my secret sauce that I would tell you: be vulnerable about who you are as a person. And this is the thing: know who you are and be vulnerable about that, but be proud of that. Wear that vulnerability on your sleeve and say, hey, I made it despite everything that was going against me. Here's why I'm going to be good for your company, because I know what I'm capable of and I know who I am as a person. Go and look at a 22-year-old like that and you'd be amazed. But here's the thing: the ingredients for all of that are in the minds of every 22-year-old I've ever met graduating college. Like, they're brilliant and they're smart and they're capable and they want to believe in something. And also there's a bunch of things as well. And you look at this, and here's my other advice for job graduates, people entering the job market for the first time that are young. And this just goes out with the handshake report. You want meaning, right? You want a job that you feel good about and you want to do things. And this is the weird part about this. People look for things. They say, I want to be passionate about this. And I love that idea. We can be passionate about anything in our jobs. We have to take pride in our work. And the hard part is, there are situations where you've got an oppressive boss, terrible coworkers who treat you poorly. Anything bad can happen. But you can cultivate, and I think one asset to have is cultivate the ability to be passionate about what you're talking about, what you're doing and what you're being in every moment or most moments that you are alive. And I think that is a lot. That's like cultivating an internal mindset and worldview. So if you can do that, if you can wake up every day and say, you know what? It's a new day. Mysteriously, I'm alive. I'm very surprised I'm alive. And meanwhile, in the same time, be like, what can I do here? Small things are meaningful. The jobs that you have are meaningful. Even if you're stapling papers together and saying there can't be any bigger picture here in this. You're doing a function in a role that needs to happen. That's why you're hired there. And it's a big deal. And you don't have to move mountains to have meaning. And meaning is what you make of it, not what other people force upon you, and not what you even think meaning should be. And so be passionate and be exactly. And that's the hard part. Oh, goodness gracious, I got to catch up on this now. Oh, goodness. Yeah, good. Aaron's got some good points. It's critical they become very domain, vertical, industry focused, certifications, books, trade mags, trade shows. I love it. Trade shows, Aaron. That's great. Absolutely right. You should, though. That's how you know those things. That's upskilling. Know all that stuff. A ton of universities are shutting down too. Really interesting. That's true. Private universities have challenges maintaining endowments. It is so hard and competitive in this market to maintain enrollments. I don't believe in following your passion. If you get a guy, that's fantastic. But the things in demand, it's the things in demand that pay. But here's the thing. I think you can that's my thing. I think it's artificial. I think we can cultivate that in what you do. The West deludes its young into thinking it is, oh, Albert, this is fascinating. The West, hold on. I got to put on my, get out my red.
I can say it.
The West deludes its young into thinking that it's passion at all costs and leaves a lot of their people jaded about their lives. That's true. It's not passion, but here's passion. Passion is created internally. It's not external. You can't rely on anything else for your passion. You have to cultivate that within yourself. And that's true. And I think that's, I would flip that around and say, I think the expectation of other people inspiring you to be passionate is incorrect. That's something that you have to develop internally. That's what it has to be. Even if it's making sandwiches. That's true. And Colin, that's true too. And you notice you always visit a different country, a different place, or whatever it is. And you notice that, hey, what's different about some places are you get a sense of pride in work. You get a sense of pride in establishment, no matter what that job is. Albert says, do we have an issue of bullshit jobs, though, which seemed to be a big issue pre-pandemic? Of course. And says all jobs fundamentally are bullshit. I can be nihilistic about this. I can smoke clove cigarettes and quote Camus. Albert says, Aaron says the higher ed industry needs to consolidate big time. That's true. We talked about the cost disease, Baumol's cost disease last time. That's when sectors that have not increased their productivity still pay higher wages, and education's one of those. Albert says, do what you love and you'll never have to work a day is the biggest lie I fell into at 22. That's really interesting. So for me, it's really interesting you say that though, right? So I had a history. So if I had a choice in my career path, if all jobs paid the same amount of money, I'd probably be a history professor. I'd be much more nuanced. Love history. I'm very passionate about it. I do it all day long. But from my perspective, though, I looked at this and said, well, I have no money. Like when I was 18, I lived in my car. So I studied money as a way to figure this out. And oh, I love that, Albert. That's so great too. And I would have done that. But here's the thing. And I became practical. I said, well, finance for me is a job, but having finance was a job that was practical enough, that earned enough money. It was something that I could do and also provided me enough income that I can pursue all my historical activities just randomly. Next week, I'm flying to Alaska. I'm going to look at all kinds of histories. I'm going up to Barrow in northern Alaska next week, just because it's got a fascinating history in itself. Albert collects old maps. Ah, that's so cool. I too, Albert, collect old maps. Sorry, people didn't come for us to go back and forth on this, but I'd love this. Melanie said she'd go back to being a bike messenger. I love bike messengers. That's great. Man, that's great. Bike messengers are awesome. I gotta give you, did you take telegrams too? Did you have these things? Hey, I've got a message. Please send it to Colin. And you drove. I need this there in 13 minutes. And then you're like, email. Aaron says, if unlimited higher ed jobs in the Soviet higher education republic, I would be a classical music historian. Geez, the digs at higher ed class. See, look at this job. Look at the story of these things. No child grows up climate-friendly email delivery. That's true. I wonder though. I wondered what the offsetting carbon of that would be. Albert says, I picked up an old newspaper from Boston the other week featuring news about the Missouri Compromise. It dated back to 1819, only $5. That is cool. I love it. Missouri Compromise, the year before it happened, people were like, compromise, that's a terrible idea. Missouri will never be a state. Aaron says, lowest carbon is just to yell. That's great. God, I love this devolved quickly into fun. That was good.
I have a follow-up
questions.
question though. And I think this would speak a little more to newer grads, but also to maybe people younger in their career, which is businesses don't really hire inexperienced workers anymore. And I feel like this has been a running trend for at least half a decade now. And my initial thoughts on this were, well, that's not sustainable. But I didn't encounter any research or literature regarding whether or not this is an actual trend or if it's just people talking about the difficulty of being unable to be hired because they don't have experience, but can't get experience because they can't get hired, which is a lot of the younger people discuss. And then so where does this path lead us? Is it actually something that's a trend? Because I do understand why businesses are hesitant to hire those that don't have experience, because then you have to do all the onboarding and then on the job training and then giving them that experience. And then that's company time and resources spent that could have been better spent on hiring someone who was experienced, and then they can come in, hit the ground running, all that good stuff. So I guess my questions are, is this a real trend? If yes, where does it lead? And is that a good place? Is that a place where we want to be? So those are my questions.
Colin, that is great. And the answer to that question that I would pose is actually is nuanced on that. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So, and this is, anecdotally, I've been part of so many hiring things. I've hired people that I've had, that I work with very closely, and staff, and we've got a staff of, 40, 50 people that help us, that do everything that runs a business college. And one of the other things that we have to grapple with too, and then you have looking at economic data, seeing what's happening, macro, micro, all that stuff. So to your point, it is true that this cycle of I have no experience, but I need a job, but the job requires experience is real. But it depends entirely on what the corporation wants to hire. If they're short on time, high stakes, high pressure, and the job market is, not particularly tight, they will vie for a experienced candidate any day of the week. If they want to pay less money and they're looking for somebody that can start at the bottom, organize all the things, somebody who simultaneously can advance to levels where they can make strategic decisions while simultaneously also developing and not, begrudge doing what somebody who is 50 might consider, kind of mindless task work. They're going to hire somebody young to fill that role with no experience, and they will develop that experience. And that depends on a few things. It depends on a nuance of what they're looking for and what they're engaging with. Both things are true. And ultimately, the case for both of them comes down to a number of soft factors. A lot of times companies don't know what they want until they interview you. And they're hiring people and they say, this person is a good fit or not a good fit. If you are able to maintain competitiveness and likability and are able to engage and be open in your job shortages and answer questions well on the job interviews, you have a story about yourself that you believe in, you will get hired. But if you're finding it an impossible way forward, the barriers are too high, you're engaged in a situation where it seems like you're trapped in a cycle where nobody's giving you the time of day or hiring you, think about what's going to revolutionize you and make you more attractive to those employers. Is it the type of job you're applying to? Is it something else? Think about changing that way. I think a lot of times, if people are caught in that cycle, and this isn't every case, they can be too narrowly focused about what their career path might be. They say, oh, I've got an electrical engineering degree, I have to be an electrical engineer. There's a whole bunch of other jobs where those technical skills become a requisite for doing many other things. And so, and that involves being creative and being open-minded to those things. But to your point, okay, macro side, where we're seeing this, the job market's tightening. That means that corporations are spending less money. And anecdotally, we looked at some data in the finance industry in particular. It used to be common to have banker training programs, other things. Those almost are, you can't find those anymore. They're hard to find. Engineers are having a rough time, as Albert pointed out. And you've got a situation where, many people are finding it, many people are finding that especially in markets that are saturated with experienced people, there's no door in when everybody knows how to make something happen. And that's where it comes down to expanding your mindset, going beyond necessarily where you think your degree might be able to take you, and looking at other and more flexible opportunities when they arrive. But it's a thing. It's a real thing, Colin. I love that. It's a real thing. Gosh, it's great.
Okay, so, but
yeah,
I think the third question was basically, where will this lead us looking 5-10 years down the line?
It's cyclical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Will companies eventually find themselves, because like people are consistently retiring, will they find themselves in a position where they need new blood and they realize
they don't have any?
There's none, and then they realize, okay, now we're gonna have to train them. And will we see that pendulum swing the other way, where companies are like, oh, we need to bring in new blood, we may as well just pay the 6 to 12 months of training to get them up to speed, blah 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 blah, all that stuff? Do we expect
That's true. So that's a good question. So let me put that in macro terms. So generational knowledge is a real thing. We've got a glut of retirees moving through the system from the baby boomer years. It will be a loss of knowledge that is key to develop younger knowledge around. Some corporations, some companies, some industries who are slow to realize this and developed in-house training programs will reap what they sow. So in other words, they will, if you don't invest in the younger generations and don't meaningfully engage them, then even if you don't feel the pain today, you don't feel the pain tomorrow, every retiree that you get, just as time passes on, you'll get this brain drain. And so they'll either adapt to your point, Colin, and they'll hire people in mass, the pendulum will swing, they'll figure out a way to develop and they'll survive, or they'll fail, or their corporate function itself will fail. So you can't do it forever is what I'm saying. And to the point of leading it this way, you have to invest, you have to go back and forth. The pendulum swings and the micro level at an individual job, whoever the hiring manager is, what they want at that time will vary. You go through this, business schools are the same way. You want a dean who changes everything. Then you want a dean who does nothing. Then you want a dean who does some things. People's opinions change depending on what they're exposed to. And as a consequence, this is exactly the same thing. And people are going to end up in a situation where corporations will be forced to adapt, or they will fail and they'll become less competitive because of their inability to grapple with some of these things that you point out. Hire young people, train them well, develop a culture that values young folks. And so that's going to be the key. You've seen the statistics and numbers now, millennials and Gen Z, they're becoming the biggest single demographic across most industries now. And it will likely continue to be so as time goes on. So be nice, hire somebody yourself, train them. And even if they leave, that's still a net information added to an industry that wasn't there before. So people are always afraid, oh, why should I train you if you're going to leave for another job in 3 years? It's the right thing to do. and you have to get them to do your job. And you're also not paying them a lot because you're training them. So stop complaining. It's my
Well,
so one of those things. Yeah.
we see certain like contracts where they're like, hey, I'll train you, but you have to work for me for 5 years.
That's true. So that's interesting. So you see those already in a different sectors in different ways. So everything from the nature of, say, you see that now in a lot of benefit contracts. Oh, we'll pay for your college education. We'll pay for this training if you promise to work for it. And otherwise, if you don't, we're going to send you a bill later on for the amount of money that you owe us to do this. And so it's likely going to be the same thing. They wouldn't be able to say, you force you to work for us and in like some kind of, 17th century, colonial situation where you're like forced indentured servitude for a period of time. You can leave your job, but they could make an argument that your training costs money, and as a consequence, it's one of those things. But I guess the light end of this, you may have seen some you may have seen some news lately about non-compete agreements that are coming through the court system right now, right?
Yeah. It was
So,
banned
so
by
yeah, exactly right. So the FTC came out and essentially banned non-compete agreements in April. And this is really interesting. This is more interesting than it seems, because if you think about this, in the finance industry, that's par for the course. You sign up for a bank, do something else, wealth management, and you're going to be like, I'm sorry, you have to sign this non-compete, because if you leave this job, you can't compete against this sort of thing. And the FTC is like, that's not competitive. So to the same spirit, Colin, I would actually argue that I would expect the FTC, and eventually, if this was somehow a widespread phenomenon that was downside, I think they would rule that it was equally uncompetitive and needed it. Here's the press release, by the way. This is a really interesting thing.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. It kicks in around July, right?
Exactly right.
Yeah. This will
We
be
estimate 18% of US workers are covered by non-competes.
yeah.
That's about that's 30 million people, according to them. That's huge.
I've never had to fight a non-compete, but I can see it being
Oh yeah.
difficult.
Oh, I know basically every financial manager I know or wealth manager I know that started out working for a different company or big company and that left to start their own company, even if they had abided by the rule of the law, gets sued by their prior employer. And then they have to fight them and they win or they settle, but it works out in their favor and then they exist as their own company. But it's widespread and it's legalistic and it's not fair. So it's interesting. So we'll see that's coming down the line too. It'll make the market more competitive. That's a good thing for everybody, even if it doesn't seem that way. So in that same spirit, I suspect that non-competitive agreements like the one you said about, hey, people saying, hey, you got to work for us for 5 years. The FTC would say tough schnoogies on that one if that was widespread. So let's talk about inflation for a second. So inflation, choppy, going in the right direction. But let's break this down a little bit. What does this mean? So the Fed has a mandate, a dual mandate. They need full employment. They shoot for this 2% inflation rate. 2%, the right amount of inflation, just enough to make prices go up and incentivize investment by companies into things that build the future, but not enough to adversely affect the average American in a meaningful way on a year-to-year basis. So CPI, which is our basket of goods that's representative of inflation, measures price increases. That's the blue line. And we've seen how that's gone up and gone down again. Now, owner equivalent rents, OERs, are a fascinating concept. An owner's equivalent rent is a measurement of how much money a property owner would have to pay in rent to be equivalent to their cost of ownership, right? So if you're sitting on that magnificent, $8 million, 600 square foot property in Atherton and saying to yourself, I'm living the good life, what is your owner equivalent rent for that property? It would be astronomical. And what we've seen is owner equivalent rents have a little bit of a delayed phenomenon. They've actually gone up a little bit after CPI, following the increase that we've seen in the housing market prices across the board, and they've come down more slowly. So what does this mean for inflation and where the Fed stands in stuff? And so if you're a positive member, and you're saying the Fed has raised rates for too long, for a long period of time. And this is not, I'm not advocating in this case a particular position either way. I'm just saying that if some economists argue that we should have cut rates earlier, some economists argue we should cut rates soon. Some economists believe we should maintain higher rates for longer. One economist here, and this is their chart, argued the Fed has achieved its mandate of low and stable inflation. If we look at what's called harmonized core inflation, which omits things like owner equivalent rents and other rental housing price increases, we have hit around the 2% target. Yay, shenanigans. What a wonderful picture this is. But why is it this way? And I want to actually bring up an article, and I want to thank Aaron in particular for bringing this to my attention. Kevin Erdman had a Substack that's very interesting to read about this. And he looks at rent inflation and tries to account for what that means. And rent inflation has been very significant. It's a big driver of where we are in the economy, and it's highly indicative of, it's a big component part of the overall CPI index. And Kevin Erdman quotes in this, there's a persistent problem of excess rent inflation. After accounting for that, rising rents during and after COVID are entirely explained by trends in general inflation, and rising home prices are entirely explained by general inflation in rent. In other words, 12-month trailing inflation, if we go back in time, across rents, it's been coming down. Shelter is delayed, but it's coming off, and that suggests that in a few months, as shelter continues to drop on its year-on-year increases, we should see that go through to the inflation numbers, and we should get inflation back continuing towards that 2% level. In the Zillow cumulative rent inflation relative to general inflation, we're basically back to where we were on the trend line since 2015. And if we look at home prices and rents went up, and they went up in such a way that they follow home prices in general. Now, there's a lot of crises into this. We haven't built nearly enough, and as a consequence, we've seen prices increase even as mortgage rates have continually remained high. Now, when we think about where this is going to go, people have argued that if the Fed were to shut down rates soon or lower rates in some way, this would reinvigorate the asset market, and we'd see house prices reaching higher and higher levels. Other people on the other say, wait a second, that's essentially not true. Even though we've built very little, there's little to suspect that in lowering rates by a significant amount, we'd necessarily see house price increases back to where they were before, given the amount that the economy can actually withstand right now. And it's probably a mixture of both things. Albert says, speaking of all that, what are the odds of a Fed put? Seems like the market has priced that in, Dow 40,000 and everything. When is the Fed going to cut rates? And if the Fed cuts rates, what that does is lower the cost for investment. It incentivizes people to buy stocks over bonds. Has a lot of other effects in the marketplace. And so what the Fed will do is they will decide, even with our languishing job market growth soon, whether or not they're going to increase or not increase, but decrease rates this year. And although we had priced in before the beginning of this year 3 cuts, the market priced in 6 cuts this year, that didn't materialize because it's been stickier and higher for longer than we anticipated. I think still, we're looking at a 50-50 shot by the end of the year for a Fed cut. My hope is that they probably will, but a couple more months or one more month of a job market number like this, it'll boost the case for a rate cut. If that doesn't happen and the job market continues to hum along, and even though consumer debt is rising, but as long as there's not a huge effect to the job market, the Fed will maintain rates higher for longer. There is that risk though, right? You've dropped it before. What happens if you have high inflation and lowering growth, but inflation remains sticky and high? I think we shouldn't see that because wage growth is not growing particularly highly. People don't have the money to spend on goods. We're starting to see price cuts in systems and retail, everything from IKEA to Costco to other places that lead me to suspect that the retail market is under pressure. And as a consequence, prices as a consequence are not going to go, are not being driven upward the way they were before. So I think that we're not going to be in a stagflation situation, but it's a real risk still of an inflation and keeping it higher for longer. But we can avoid it if the Fed cuts moderately or cuts mildly, even signaling that they'll cut by the end of the year. We'll see what happens. I think it's going to be a really interesting phenomenon to watch. But basically, rents and rates, it's interesting to follow this. But a lot of people are like, no, we can't lower rates because it'll increase asset prices. Maybe. I think right now there's still a lot of disequilibrium in the system. And right now, for instance, in many sectors, places, even from Florida in particular, you've seen inventories increase rapidly. That's going to put some downward price pressures on housing. If that's a bit more widespread, then you'll start to see some better outcomes for individuals. So we had a question on the deck about gas prices. So gas prices are fascinating. Where does gas come from? Ultimately, it's derived from oil. Oil, how is it priced? And so on the bottom chart here, I've got something called WTI. That's West Texas Intermediate. In the town of Cushing, Oklahoma, they determine the price of oil. And because oil uses futures, these are contracts that promise a future date of delivery. So the oil market here, priced in July 2024, so delivery of oil by July of 2024, that tells you kind of what people expect prices to be, where prices are shaping up. Right now, it's about $78 a barrel. That is, we go over the long run, significantly higher than the $25 a barrel it was back in 2003, but lower than some of the spikes we've seen due to various crises. It was when it was over $100 a barrel in 2007, back in 2014, and again, right after the pandemic lows that we hit in 2020. And so oil, of course, being determined, it can be determined by WTI often in North America, Brent for Europe and many other places in the world. Leads to gas prices. And gas prices, of course, are affected highly by state taxes on gasoline, which vary from state to state. But all things considered, the cheapest gas are in the south central parts of the United States, higher along the coast. Gas prices, because we're such a car-dominant culture, does eat into economic growth. And it does have a lot of effect. And that was the purpose of the question. It has a lot of effect on people's perception of how the economy is doing, even though it has nothing to do with the economy in general. It's a supply and demand issue on a commodity. And if something goes up or something goes down in price, it increases. It's based on supply and demand. And what's interesting about this is you see increases in prices, people saying, it's the president. Or then the prices decrease. And the president says, it's because I'm the president. As it turns out, that really doesn't matter a great deal in the long term when it comes to oil prices, an internationally traded commodity. Colin says, my Pacific gas and electric bill has tripled in 2 years. Anyone else? Good golly, that's terrible to hear about. PG&E, wow, goodness gracious. Corn additives and PG&E, that's terrible. For using the same amount of electricity, Colin, I got to write a letter. I got a poster on my back wall. My great grandmother's brother was Peter Donahue, who lived in San Francisco and built the first gas lighting system in San Francisco. And then he was bought out by Pacific Gas and Electric, what became Pacific Gas and Electric in the late 1800s. So it is his fault, even though as descendant of his sister, I am not, I promise. His sister got like nothing in the will. It was like a $50 pension. He's like, I hate my family. And that's why I have no money. But it's terrible. Did it really increase threefold, Colin, for the same amount of energy?
I looked at my historical, so I was paying about 300 a month in 2022, and now I'm closer to 800 and 900 a month. It's absolutely insane. And I don't believe PG&E has produced, better service or
Are you serious?
I've kept every single bill.
Wow. Is that a typical bill for you?
I just it's a month, every
wow.
month. So yeah, it's absolutely insane. They just increase the rates. I don't even know what they're increasing. I just see my bill shoot up. I'm not growing anything. It's just it used to be 300 a month. Now it's like 800 and 900 a month. I'm coming out of winter, so I was using some heat, but it shouldn't be that much.
No, if you want to know,
this has actually spurred me to look into getting solar.
That's a huge incentive to do so.
It's an absolutely huge incentive because
man,
at this point is just I need to. I do keep the heater off, but I live with people who get cold apparently. So
that's my question. Andrew says, "What 800 a month? Are you growing at 6,000 square feet?"
It's insane. Um,
No, that's terrible. I mean,
I feel
Colin, I
like
gotta tell
if
you,
we ran a podcast,
yeah.
Albert and Riley, we can just talk about PG&E,
Hmm.
the ethics of a state-sanctioned monopoly. How come me as the consumer, I don't get to
Oh
vote with
yeah,
the wallet when it comes to utilities?
that's fun.
Like this is as anti-capitalism as possible, but I also don't like what Texas is doing. So there's a whole lot of stuff we can discuss. Just the topic, 1 hour podcast, PG&E and how they're screwing me over.
Done. Colin, this seems personal. I was looking at, so obviously I live in New Mexico. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I pay about $110 a month for my electric bill and $30 for gas. So 140 total. And it's like, and I'm like, I feel like that's a lot. And it's like, I don't live in a mansion. It's like a 2000, it's like a regular old house, 2000 square foot house, that kind of thing. Relatively modern. So that when I hear these numbers, I'm like, I'm sticker shock astonished. But to your point about utilities, they're fascinating things. When we have monopolies, they are, to your point, a state sanctioned monopoly. You look at this question, that's why they're so highly regulated, is because of utilities are interesting structures. Ideally, in a market, you want to create a free market where there's a lot of buyers, a lot of sellers. That's the best price. You can't run 30 lines of utility wires that are repetitive, against one another across the street because it's not practical. And so governments decided in the last 100 years or so that, hey, these things have to be monopolies, but we got to sanction them so they don't, screw over consumers at the same time. And so that's why we've got the situation that we have in, and different regulatory bodies have different roles in this. But man, that's crazy, PG&E. That's amazing. Man, I should have.
Oh, I'm getting it. It's an abusive relationship and I can't walk away.
Man, I just didn't know. I just didn't know if there was like a live gas flare behind you right now. If it's like
No.
a
It
thing
used to
that's
be like
burning.
200 to 300 used to be the cap, right? And then this winter I was seeing 800, 900 roll in and going, what is going on? Oh my God, it absolutely bad. And I'm just thinking, is it the fuel? But that shouldn't be impacting my.
It's terrible. And the fuel prices, to your point, Colin, relatively speaking, very stable for the last 3 years, give or take. We haven't had a big crisis on this. Andrew really wants to know how big your house is, Colin. You got to drop it like it's hot. Are you?
I don't know actually. Closer to 3,000 square feet, maybe.
Oh, that's nice. There you go. So it's sizable.
It's a sizable house,
Yeah.
but it's not like I run like two computers and it my usage of energy has not tripled in the last 2 years. I can guarantee you that. But the rates have every January they just send, oh, we're increasing your rates by 30%.
Wow. That's insane. Like I can't. That's sorry, Colin. You need you got to pay really.
I'm just sitting here like I didn't vote for that, and but apparently it's greenlit by some
Oh wait, hold on. I got a picture of Colin's house here. Hold on, it's coming. There we go. Oh, there it is. There we go, right there, Colin. It looks very nice.
I wish I lived in that.
Oh look, I like that.
Actually, I don't wish I lived in that. That looks like a horrible thing to maintain.
Look at this good. Like your choice of deck furniture, though, and your pool looks very nice. And then the gilded statue of Albert is a nice added there. That's very good. That's very nice. That's what it comes down to. Section 174. So you mentioned this. We've talked about this. Everyone knows about Albert. What are the property taxes? Colin, Colin, let's do an hour-long podcast about your house. I think that's what the audience is asking for at this point.
I feel like my neighbors are paying similar rates. I need to ask them, but I do know one of my neighbor is closer to 600.
That's my
The last time we talked. I don't know.
Elon Musk, my neighbor. My neighbor. That is still too much money. That's obscene.
It's too much. 300 I was fine with. 200 to 300 I was fine with. A 900, no, man. Getting somewhere as fast as possible.
I have to look down. I don't know the reason for your increase, but I'm curious now. So I'm gonna look at it. I'll see if I can.
I just look up PG&E rate increases. It's insane. Everyone else lives in the Bay Area. Your rates haven't increased as much. There's no way I'm alone in this.
Wow, 900. Thanks,
Yeah,
man.
someone just said
900 to
900
1200 a month.
Yeah, tripled
Wow.
or less. Yeah, yours tripled. Mine is just tripled too, from 250 to
God,
300.
this is
Now it's
insane.
closer to 800.
Now I go back, now I'm looking back at this chart going, of course they're going to other states for AI generation.
Oh,
I asked
it's
AI where
fine.
you should
Me
live.
thinking I need to leave. I need to leave Bay Area. I can't afford this.
Wow.
Like,
And paying for their mistakes, fires, exactly. Terrible. Terrible to think
yeah,
about,
we're
right?
just passing on the
Infrastructure
buck.
costs. They're obscene. Obscene. I like your house though, Colin. It's very nice. Section 174. Catan says, I paid 89 last month. Yours seemed pretty steep. A 300 square foot studio, but still, I know.
So like multiply it by 10, right?
There you go.
If you multiply it by 10, you'll have around the size of my house, and that would be closer to $900.
I'm
That's
working
all
on a
right.
plan. I
That's
feel like I can make a
proportional.
profitable rig where I can generate energy in New Mexico for Colin, and then he can just buy it off of me for
I wish.
a
I'm just gonna
fraction of the
install
price.
solar.
That'll be great. $100 for 813 square foot in Oakland, electric only, Melanie. Excellent.
Nice, nice.
Interesting. Zoom Meter says people in Silicon Valley. That's good. Interesting. Solar Panel Company LLC. You're darn right it's an LLC. Got to make sure that falls through my tax write-off, especially if there's. That's really interesting. A high income area. So interesting.
Ooh, section 174.
So section 174. All right. So let's talk a little bit about this. And I love this more. We're gonna continue back. Our next we'll do a deep dive into Colin's house next week. Next month. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act said that businesses can no longer immediately deduct R&E expenditures. Instead, they have to amortize these expenses over 5 years for U.S. incurred costs and 15 years for expenses incurred internationally. And so Marsha's like, Marsha, an anonymous person who might be Marsha asked, did this affect the job market, right? Wasn't this designed to make it more competitive, to make it better for hiring, and to make the situation better? And Debbie Levitt, if you haven't seen Debbie Levitt's LinkedIn post on this, I think is the easiest way. She provides the easiest example of how this affected companies and how that might lead to layoffs that I've ever seen. So here's why. So imagine you're living in the old tax law situation where you could deduct all of these rents, equipment, and all these tax write-offs that you had at that time. So you made $2 million in revenue. And let's say that you had $1 million of salary costs and $1 million of other costs. That's $2 million of tax write-offs. 2 million in revenue, $2 million of tax write-offs in the old law. So possible outcome means you have no tax liability that year. Great. Hire people, make things happen, make the money. New tax law, you still have a $2 million in revenue that you have, but now your write-offs are limited. 10% of your salaries, 10% of your other expenses. That's only $200K. Going from zero taxable revenue to $1.8 million in taxable revenue. Where are you going to come up with that money to pay it if you haven't already budgeted that into your corporation? Because of that potential high tax liability, you've made it challenging for corporations to raise that money quickly. And as a consequence, this is a significant tax burden, especially for small businesses. And as a consequence, they will have to reduce expenses rapidly, creating layoffs. Another example, 2021 with $1 million. You had R&E expenses of $250,000. You had an allowable $250,000 deduction, $750,000 taxable. You owed $157,000 in taxes. 2022 happens. You can no longer write off that $250K, just 10%. Your year one allowable was $25,000. That means your taxable income is up to $975,000. You've got a tax bill that's $50,000 higher. So you're going to lay off your favorite employee. Section 174 did have an effect that way, and certainly in that context, that does relate to Marsha's question about how this leads to tax, the layoffs that we've seen in the last couple of years, because this is disproportionately hitting a lot of businesses that weren't accustomed to paying taxes before and needed to cut workers that way. It does not explain larger companies who cut workers in different ways for a bunch of other reasons, including overhiring in the COVID-19 pandemic, and then having to get rid of those workers as rates came up and their growth prospects dwindled. And so it's a combination of both things. Marcia, this was a great question, and I loved it having. But yes, is absolutely feasible. This led to a large number of layoffs as it pertained to smaller companies because of the tax bill they had to pay. I had another question about Brexit. How does it affect our economy here in North America? We know it affected Britain. Goldman Sachs estimates the UK economy underperformed its peers by 5% since Brexit. In North America, a lot of this has been indirect. Anytime one of your big trading partners loses money, it is bad for you. They have less money to spend on you, and as a consequence, that does affect your economy. But in addition, you've got higher logistics and administrative costs. You've got to rethink your market strategy, and supply chains are affected because you've got to figure out what you're going to do in a complex legal environment where once you thought it was part of Europe, something bigger, now they have their own nuances, their own education, their own variables that you have to account for when you're doing your corporate planning. Data regulations and talent mobility are big factors there, and it is absolutely a big factor. The Prime Minister, Sunak, just called for elections early on July 4th. A risky venture for the Conservative Party, who might not be able to win a majority in the upcoming election. Now, other news of note for the small business side of this. Are small businesses planning to hire? In 2021, we were at a peak. Since then, we've seen a decline in small business hiring. Can small business hire enough workers? Percentage with at least one unfilled opening, that's dropping. And the small business optimism is also dropping. So across the board, more signals that the economy right now is weakening. Bringing it down to the Bay Area in our last couple of slides here, last slide. In San Francisco, Oakland, Hayward, and shenanigans. Our March data, which is our most recent, showed a nice fall to 4.2% in the unemployment rate, with unemployed individuals dropping by 7,000, a positive change over prior months, which is a really good sign in the Bay Area, but not one month does not itself a trend make. And so we have to watch these numbers in particular to make sure that this is something that can be maintained. You saw a boost of about 3,000 in education and health service employment. You've seen at the same time languished government employment. Financial activities are basically flat, information dropping yet another 300 jobs, and manufacturing falling a bit too. On the other side, if we reach down across the bay to San Jose, Sunnyvale, we've got unemployment also dropping in similar fashion, but we've seen some variables here as well of note. In the month between March and April, we've seen more or less flat employment across the board. Government lost about 1,000 jobs. Information sector lost another 500. And so mirroring what we're seeing across the economy as a whole, manufacturing jobs, after being boosted a little bit, still continuing to slide in the San Jose area. If we go back to November, we're down about 4,500 jobs in that sector. Big factors, big issues that happen here. And it is a weakening job market. And while the Bay Area is a nice bellwether of the overall economy in the United States, unemployment rates have been running higher in the area than the national average, an unusual factor for an area that is normally a catalyst for U.S. economic growth and sees unemployment rates that are in fact lower. So in short, Dr. White, how screwed is the Bay Area economically? Is the sky falling? It's rough out there in the Bay Area. It's rougher than many parts of the country. It doesn't mean the sky is falling, but things, even though things might be good in aggregate for the rest of the country, it might be good to have rates higher for longer for asset prices, among other things. The Bay Area needs to do a lot to improve its position and make itself more desirable for people to live, work, and start companies in. That means it has to figure out ways to build better, build more stuff, better stuff, and to improve the economy in ways that keeps jobs from moving elsewhere. At the same time, it has such a deep and competitive venture capital startup market that it has all the ingredients for future success in corporations if it can make that happen. But it's going to have to navigate a lot of difficult factors. So be active, try to get them to do stuff, try to get things to change. It's going to be, you don't want this. There will be another growth sector. And if rates drop, that will incentivize a lot of new companies, a lot of new stock offerings, and a lot of new stuff. But is the manufacturing number going to take a huge tumble in a few months when Tesla's layoffs are reported? Tesla will have an effect, but it'll be probably balanced by other places. I think right now one benefit, and this is interesting, manufacturing, there's been so much aggregate investment across the country due to our last 2-year investment in onshoring a lot of our capacity. Not a lot of that has gone into the Bay Area. A lot of that's gone into other states to build things like factories and plants and other things. And in the Bay Area, you're going to see this divergence, I think, between manufacturing in the traditional sense, moving to other places where it can afford and hire a labor force of skilled workers, which are now available in more parts of the country than they were before. But also you're going to see this churn. You have a lot of startup capital, a lot of ability to start up new and perhaps more new biomanufacturing institutions. But it will be interesting how it pans out, and where those workers go will be fascinating. Aaron says the Bay Area needs a new economic unleashing. Yep, taxes, regulations, permits, maybe for 1 year at a time. Done and done, Aaron. If I could wave a magic wand, I would do all those things. Albert says CEQA suspension for 5 years. Word. Build housing like crazy. Business tax suspension for 5 years. There's a rate. Make it easier in the Bay Area to hire, add tech and industrial parks and market around the world, Aaron says. Bring in thousands of companies from the rest of the U.S. world. Rebuild Oakland. Oakland's 6 years behind. It needs to become a new Rotterdam. Oh, that's good too. Solid policy suggestions from the seats today and my co-panelists here. This is great. Great suggestions. That's where we are right now. So what are we going to do for it? How are you going to fix the economy? Thank you, those of you who have stayed long. I appreciate your questions. That's what I got for the paperwork. Anybody else? Anything else that we didn't talk about this? Oh, Oakland does need so much right now. It lost 4 sports teams in the last 6 years. At this rate, just think how many sports teams it's going to lose. All right. Questions? Anybody have anything? Carmen, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming and rocking and rolling. Thank you for sticking long. I know we're about a little bit over time. Albert or Colin. Albert says, what about the current economic situation as it relates to the election? Oh, yes. I got some more question to answer too. Yes. So here's the thing. Gosh, we talked about elections in the economy a little bit last time, and that's where I was. Thank you. Let me bring up my mass questions list. Albert wants to make sure I didn't miss anybody's questions. I did have a lot, and a lot that I didn't answer particularly effectively, but let me drop on down here and I'll read the limit of this. And so we had a question: how is the U.S. presidential election affecting hiring, if at all? This is tough and this is interesting. So the gear up towards these giant spending regimes hire a lot of part-time employees, a lot of temporary workers. And that is beneficial. And it's interesting to see if some of this will show up in some of that part-time versus full-time data that we're seeing. And what hiring implications do you see at the election in each scenario? So this says there's a market for temporary workers who fulfill a lot of posts that deal with the elections. And general, it does have a benefit for advertisers, channels, traditional media, and other places that benefit from just the mass expense that both of these campaigns end up producing. However, in the aggregate size of the U.S. economy, it doesn't move the needle a whole lot. There's a lot of research that shows that there's variance depending on the type of president who's elected, and there's some correlations between, how the stock market does 1 year versus the next year. None of these are necessarily applicable for this election year. So that's the really hard part. Melanie, Oakland's probably the old Belfast. I was in Belfast last year. That was great fun. It's up and coming or out and going, or it's all kinds of things. Oakland could be the new Columbia, South Carolina. Oakland, the new Greenville, Spartanburg. That's great. Oakland, what a great motto.
So with just those final thoughts, then, what is your advice to job seekers? What do they do the next month? Because, we are heading into the summer months too. And I do believe you might have debunked last year that there is no hiring correlation between the early months of the year, the middle months, and the later months of the year.
That's right. We did go through that. We did an analysis. And you're saying, is this the time to be hired? Any time is the time to be hired. Don't give up hope. I think Aaron said it really effectively in the chat and other places. You got to upskill, upskill, upskill. go know your business, know your strategy, depending on what you are, be aggressive about those things. And if it's not working for you in one sector, expand the sphere of where you're hiring for jobs, update that cover letter, wear your vulnerability as your weapon, tell them a story about yourself that nobody can take away from you. All that. And Marsha's advice. Marsha's got good advice too. All that and vote for better policy.
Oh goodness.
Yes, Marsha.
I mean,
Yes.
we're not endorsing anyone here in particular, but has New Mexico had their primary elections yet?
That's a good question. Yes, we're working on that now. We're primarying those things. We are a blue state, so as a consequence, we've got a few things rocking and rolling. It's not necessarily highly competitive in a lot of districts in the state, but put on there, and the policies are interesting. We suffer from the same policy issues a lot of California does. We don't like to build a lot of homes. We underbuild, and as a consequence, even
though New Mexico has so much wide open land. I mean, right?
2.2
We all watch Breaking Bad.
Right, 2 million people. I know I've got 3 meth labs in my backyard at this moment. And it's good. You gotta get
This is on the record, Dr.
Oh,
White.
let's get it on the record. They're my neighbors' meth labs. No, they're 2 million people, over 121,000 square miles, fifth biggest state in the country by area. But at the same time, you look at Albuquerque and Santa Fe, they have land use restrictions, which are taken out of the California book. And as a consequence, they don't build enough and prices are high. Even for a city like I live in Santa Fe, the average home price is about $600,000, which is not a lot by California standards, but a lot for New Mexico incomes. And that's a thing to note as well. So yes, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I like meeting with you. I like making, I like helping you with job advice, any other questions, making connections, keep me posted. Thank you, Andrew. David asks, how's the overall outlook on part-time roles across the sectors that have increased headcount? Ooh, that's really interesting. So part-time roles are going to be tricky throughout this. Right now, because we're in a tightening market for the job market as a whole, I would suspect that companies will be more enthusiastic about part-time roles, particularly with uncertainty as it pertains to their own investment in economic development in the future. So if you're looking for part-time, I think you will see opportunities opening up in the next couple of years, but that's not necessarily a good thing. But I think that you got to get those jobs while you have them and keep trying, keep rocking and rolling. So I love it. It's great.
Awesome. Cool. So those are our thoughts. I just dropped in the comments section too here. Please join us again on June 20th for more of this fun that you've just had for the last hour and a half. We'll be answering the same questions as usual. Is inflation going down, and can we lower interest rates yet? And how will that impact my job search? As the world turns, we will see what happens here in the next month, and we hope to see you all then. Thank you all again so much, and have a great rest of your week and a good Memorial Day weekend. We'll talk soon.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody, as always. You guys are awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Marsha. This is great. Thanks, Melanie. And we'll put up a fund for Colin's electric bill.
All right.
Good.
I looked into it. PG&E said the cost of electricity just increased by $100.